First off, I know there's an amazing amount of other things you could be seeing, so thanks very much for coming to this talk. I know it's probably one of the least inspiringly named talks, Education RCTs. I'll tell you the slightly dull story about how we came to have such a dull name. But what's really exciting about it is that we've got some really great speakers. I'm delighted that some of them have flown over from the US in the midst of a very, very busy time of year. If you do education research, coming over in the beginning of September or late August is not a trivial thing, because inevitably you have a million things going on. So we've got a great lineup. The format's going to be very, very simple. Each speaker's going to come up, talk for 10 minutes about the most exciting work that they've done in the past and what they've got going on right now. It's then over to you for 5 minutes of questions. Please be as provocative and aggressive as you like. All the speakers have asked me to encourage that. And then when these guys are all done, there'll be a general Q&A session. And a general Q&A session, I would like us to talk about, so there's a lot of trials going on in education. What kind of stuff do we think we should be doing in the future? What are the themes that are emerging? So if there's a question for the individual speaker, please try and keep it focused on their work, because a general overview of where we're all going together is going to come towards the end. We're going to finish about 15, 20 minutes before the stated end time. Partly, you guys have been here for a couple of days, and there's only so much excitement you can take. But also, many of you are going to have more involved questions than this format is really going to be suitable for. So the guys are going to hang around till the end of the session, and then please come and talk to them in person and have a conversation. Okay, so we thought the best way to start a session like this would be to have somebody who has a really solid overview of the literature, what trials have achieved, what trials can't really tell you, and they can give us a quick rundown of what's happened with RCTs. So I'm delighted that Anna has agreed to do this. Anna is Professor of Education at University of Cambridge. Also does a lot of work with the EEF and ESRC on general evaluation stuff for them, and I'm sure, well, she can tell you more about that if you like. But otherwise, let's just get on with Anna's presentation. Please welcome her on. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Raj, and thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm going to talk a little bit about education research and the role of randomized controlled trials. And then, outrageously, I'm going to attempt to summarize what we think we know about education and what we don't know, which clearly is going to fail before I even start. But the idea will be to tell you some kind of broad framing questions that we do have some answers to, and also highlight areas where we think we need to know an awful lot more. So the first issue, RCTs. When I started doing education research, which was a rather number of years ago, my first piece of work was on class size, the importance of class size for pupil achievement. And I was doing a study in the UK. And I was fascinated by a large and one of the very few randomized controlled trials in education from America, the Tennessee class size experiment. In that experiment, children were randomly allocated to small and medium-sized classes, and the impact on their achievement was evaluated. A lovely bit of work, and it's been followed up many times, and we can talk about what it tells us in a minute. But what was really interesting, of course, was the methodology, being a randomized controlled trial. And at that point, I can honestly say I didn't meet any educationist who thought it was remotely possible that, in the UK at least, that we would be allowed to do RCTs of a similar nature, for a number of reasons, some of it practical. Ethics was mentioned a lot. And I certainly think there was a general reluctance from within the education research community to think it was a good idea. Now, don't get me wrong, randomized controlled trials are only one methodology, obviously, that you would want to use to undertake education research. They're certainly not the best method in every instance to answer each research question that you might have. But they do exemplify a certain type of education research, which I would describe as evaluative. It's moving into a world where we expect to see robust empirical evidence of impact from what we do in the education system. And whether we get that through randomized controlled trials, or whether we get it through quasi-experimental methodologies, or ideally, whether we get it from a mixture of experimental and non-experimental quantitative and qualitative methods, we certainly need that kind of evidence. But there has, I think it's safe to say, if I can get the slide to work, been some resistance from within the field of education, and I'm going to put up two quotes that you can read at your leisure to illustrate this point. These are two quotes, one from David Hargreaves, around about the time that New Labour came to power in the late 1990s, talking very much about the need for I won't use the term what works research, I will use evaluative research, but he was pressing on the government and indeed education researchers to do more research that would be practicable and useful in the classroom, and most of all, evaluated what we did in the classrooms. And then roll on 20 years later, and as you can see from the quote from Ben Goldacre, pretty much he's saying the same thing. So 20 years have gone by and we're still talking about how it'd be really good to have a good evidence base from which we could draw on, and that education needs to move in the same direction as medicine, etc., etc. So I won't dwell on that, but I think it's important to remember that as background. What I would say, however, is that things are definitely changing. And I apologise for talking mostly about the UK, but I'm thinking from a UK perspective here. Things are changing, and there's been an increased interest in evaluative research, including RCTs. The RCT push has come partly through the US government insisting on more RCT evidence, but I think the big change here has also been the Education Endowment Foundation pushing the RCT methodology. And I leave it to you to judge whether it's interesting that the EEF is actually a non-academic institution that has been sort of pushing in the field of education the RCT methods. But now I would say that the field has definitely shifted. We're seeing more RCTs come through, and some of those are now being done within universities funded by ESRC and other funders. So what are the problems with RCTs? I'm clear that they're not the only answer, and I've said that already. There are some issues with RCTs that we can't ignore. One is the generalizability. So the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, has done a huge amount. They commissioned a number of RCTs, but it's barely scratching the surface of what we want to know about education research. And many of the questions that we have will not be answered by RCT. So I think we need to be really mindful of that. And lots of the evidence that we do get from RCTs won't necessarily be generalized to the nation or to other countries, etc. The other thing is RCTs are expensive as well, which has been created a barrier. But what I would say is we're now in a position where we're starting to see more research come through the system in UK and US that's evaluative and thinking in robust terms about what the impact of what we're doing in the school system really is on pupils. And I think the next stage is to make it a lot more accessible to practitioners and better communicated to policymakers, which is an area we still need to work on. So having given you a very brief flavour of what I think is happening in the research field as a whole, from a methods perspective, what is it that we know? This is not what we know from RCTs, this is what we know from what I would consider reasonably robust evidence, evaluative research, including experimental and quasi-experimental methodologies. We know that early years are critical, that's for sure. We know that gaps in pupils' achievement emerge very early, and we've got reasonably robust evidence that interventions that are aimed at very young children, particularly from disadvantaged families, can be effective. Not to say that all early interventions are effective, but they can be when targeted and when they're intensive enough and sufficiently well resourced. We also can quantify, if you like, the impact of parents and family background. So we know that the family household is incredibly important to children and their educational development. What we're much weaker on is how we help parents parent, although the evidence base is definitely emerging from that. More work to be done, but it's moving in the right direction. But again, the parenting interventions on which we have best evidence would suggest we're talking about pretty intensive interventions here to help parents having a positive impact. We're not talking about, an hour's parenting class necessarily having that big of an impact. What we also know is that we need to be careful about how we think about quality, whether it's in nursery provision, primary school provision, secondary school provision. Things like pupil-teacher ratios are not good guides to quality. And in fact, one of the conundrums in the literature is often we know something matters, we know schools matter, we know teachers matter, we know the effect that they're having on pupils' achievement, but we're much weaker on saying, and it's caused by this factor, it's caused by employing teachers who don't have this qualification. So the specifics of how we measure quality is one of the pressing issues, I think, in education today. The other thing is that there has been a little bit of a false dichotomy set up between early and late investment in children, I think, and I think the literature has moved on, and now people recognizing that early interventions, early investment is generally productive, leads to good outcomes, but unless it's sustained, any benefits you get from it are likely to peter out over time. We also know really that a lot of what policymakers get quite agitated about and spend a lot of time thinking about don't matter as much as we think that they do. So policymakers worry about structures. They worry about schools. They worry about how schools are designed and how the system is put together. But in fact, although schools do matter, the teacher is mattering far more. And although resources matter, what you do with those resources matters far more. Now, these are very bland statements, so what can we actually do with them? Well, we know that resources are more important for disadvantaged pupils, but we can also probably conclude that if you just arbitrarily increase funding for a particular group of pupils, you're not necessarily going to see achievement gains across the board unless you actually have in place mechanisms for spending that resource wisely and evaluating whether it's having a good impact. On school structures, there is some evidence from the UK that some of the early academies, sort of charter equivalent schools, have a positive impact on pupils' achievement. But I don't think we can kind of generalize from that to the later academies because they're quite different schools. But I think the last bullet point is really important. We've had 30 years of competition and choice, and we're still finding quite mixed evidence on its impact on pupil achievement. And I want to be really clear here, I'm not suggesting that competition and markets in schooling don't work. I'm saying that actually the market in the UK is very circumscribed, very limited in a number of dimensions. And in fact, we have not seen the gains in pupil achievement or efficiency that we might have expected or hoped for from introducing competition and choice. And we can debate which direction to go from that statement. So finally, improving teaching is clearly, in the literature, the way that we will improve outcomes. So if we could do anything in the system, it would be to focus on teachers and teaching. We know that in the UK, external bodies like Ofsted have judged the majority of our teachers to be effective, so I don't think we have a problem of bad teachers throughout the system by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think we have quite a major problem in the teaching profession. We have a very high dropout rate. We have lots of surveys telling us various things about teachers' unhappiness. We have a system that, although schools have been given permission to pay teachers differently, they haven't thus far. And as a consequence, we have shortages in particular subject areas, shortages that look to be getting worse as the real wages of teachers declines. These are things we should be extremely concerned about. The other thing is, despite knowing that teachers are everything, we still don't have good evidence on how to educate them, how to train them. In the UK, we've had a lot of tweaking of teacher education and teacher training, but actually, at the moment at least, we don't really have good evidence on how best to train a teacher. And anyway, even that is a sort of kind of missing the point because we have 400,000 teachers in our system, so we really need to think about educating and training existing teachers as much as how we train teachers on their way into the profession. We've played with performance-related pay as a way to incentivize teachers. The evidence on that is positive in some instances, but mixed overall, suggesting that how you introduce performance-related pay is very important. But if you take the body of evidence on teaching and teachers as a whole, my conclusion from it is that there is no doubt that teachers and teaching are the key element in the system, and that we need to focus on improving both what goes on in the classroom in the form of teaching, but also the role of teacher. And we should be perhaps particularly worried about skills shortages in particular teacher subjects. So I will stop there, and the whistle-stop tour of everything we know about education. Do you want me to take questions now? Or?
Yeah, sure. But, are there any questions about what Anna's gone over? I know it's quite a broad overview. I have one or two myself.
You can start with the difficult ones.
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to ask was, it sounds like, well, to me, I might say this in a completely biased way, but it seems like the fact that you have more and more RCTs in schools now introduces more people into schools to try new stuff. Do you think that's kind of changed the discourse, the way people talk about education, that actually it is possible to reform stuff and it's impossible to see those changes quicker than maybe people would have even considered before people were doing trials, say, 20 years ago?
Yes, I mean, as I said, I think it's nothing short of miraculous that in a relatively short period of time we've moved from RCTs are impossible to, I think they've got 70, 80 running at the moment.
Matthew from EF is here, I'm sure he could tell
You can tell me how many you've got.
85.
85, not bad.
Thank you.
You know, we've moved from that position in a very short period of time, and that's good. But I suspect in the long run, the benefits of specific RCTs, you know, it's a long, long haul to accumulate the evidence from RCTs. But what we will have done is had schools interact with researchers, and schools interact with research evidence to a greater extent than has been possible. And I think that's likely to have a really good long-term impact on sort of teachers' knowledge of the research base.
Great. Thanks very much, Anna. If you join us again at the questions, it'd be great.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, there was one more. Because Laurie from... So if you could wait 1 second, Laurie, whilst we bring a microphone down. And if you could just quickly introduce yourself as well, that would be handy. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Laurie Forcier. I'm here from Pearson. I noticed that the 3 slides that you showed have a focus on schools. If you were to do a quick rundown on what we know from RCTs that have happened in higher ed, what would your highlights be?
That's an interesting one. Higher education in terms of learning, teaching and learning, is pretty much still a black box research-wise, but we know an awful lot about inputs in and outputs. So I can tell you a lot about variation in earnings and outcomes. We know higher education has still got average high value, but increasing variation. Not all degrees are valuable. It varies by subject. It varies by institution. So we can say all this, but actually learning in HE and how that's developing over time, the use of technology, and what happens to disadvantaged learners within HE, actually we know remarkably little about that. Not to say there aren't a lot of psychological studies looking at specific groups within HE, but I think that's an area that needs a lot more work. And as far as I know, no RCTs, oh no, I beg your pardon, Simon's RCTs, a few RCTs linked to higher education, but not necessarily in higher education, trying to encourage school kids to go to higher education. And I think it's quite interesting that when I've approached higher education institutions about running randomized control trials, I've been assured by them that it's impossible to run RCTs and that it's particularly difficult to get schools to run RCTs. So I point them to the EF and say, well, could we have another conversation once you've had a look at that?
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. Next up was Simon, and we're going to start moving around some different players in the education field, and Simon's going to talk about pupils. I should also mention that Simon is a professor of economics at the University of Bristol, in case you didn't see it earlier, and full disclosure, he's also my PhD supervisor, so I have a best interest in being
difficult questions.
Especially nice to him. Okay, off you go, Simon, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. So I'm going to take a slightly different line here and talk about one RCT in particular, which has been funded by EEF, so thanks very much to them. These are the list of co-authors, including Sally, who's going to speak next. So yesterday we heard about all of the big problems in the world and how behavioral insights and RCTs could help solve some of those big problems. So education's clearly up there as a way of solving big problems. Education matters a lot for growth, for prosperity. It matters for getting on in life, for social mobility, for how you escape difficult neighborhoods, poor schools, and so on and so on. And it matters for inequality. So a lot of the things that citizens, policymakers care about, education, getting education right, is key to that. And so Anna's very helpfully just gone through a long list of things that matter for education, that matter for generating skills. All of these things we've talked about, there's lots and lots and lots of research about all of these things. And I think there is a tendency actually just to ignore the person at the middle of all of this, the kid who shows up for school and goes through a lot of learning and then takes a very important test at the end. What do we know about what they contribute? Okay, so the RCT I'm going to talk about is about student effort. So by this I mean effort very broadly, so it's not measured in sweat, it's not necessarily measured in hours, it's measured in the ability to concentrate and to focus and to be determined to avoid distractions and just get on with your work. Okay? So a few recent papers have shown that actually student effort matters. It's not the case that by the time you turn up 16 to take your really, really important exams, everything is determined. Okay? You can still learn, you can still decide to put time and effort in this sense into your studies and do much better. So the question is, how, in that case, how can we encourage kids to put more effort in? Again, effort in a very broad sense. Which leads to the question, well, what motivates children in school? And how can we tweak those motivations to generate more effort? Now, of course, there is a natural and inherent incentive for trying hard at school. Everyone in this room knows that. We all know that if you work hard at school, you get good qualifications, and then you get good earnings, an interesting job, and a great life. But not everybody necessarily sees those links. And there are different places in those links that might break down in some people's heads. They may not believe that a qualification in their neighborhood is actually going to help them get a job. They may not think, more importantly, that their trying hard actually makes any difference to them. They may think it's all in their genes. They may think it's all in their parental background. And what they do is just an X factor society. You've either got it or you haven't, and if you haven't, there's no point in trying. So there are all sorts of reasons why people may not believe in that inherent natural incentive. And of course, we know that talking to a 14-year-old, 15-year-old and saying, if you work hard at school, you know, in 20, 30 years' time, you're really going to be pleased that you did, is essentially pointless. 20 or 30 hours is a bit more than a lot of them can handle, I have to say. So I think there is a sense of an idea that actually if we could just sort of get them over this hurdle and get people trying a bit harder right now, then that would be a good thing to do on top of the inherent natural incentives. So there's this quote from Roland Fryer, using incentives as a way of kind of getting over that immediate problem. So I don't have very long, I only have 10 minutes. I'm going to talk to you about this project in a very general, hopefully not vague way, and I'm going to focus on the ideas rather than any specific results. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to increase human capital to raise the skills of the kids in our treatment schools over a whole school year. So we're working with schools for a full school year. The aims are to increase their human capital, to raise their skills, and to influence how they do on really high stakes exams that you take in this country at the end of compulsory schooling. So these are called GCSEs, and they're very high stakes for the kid, they're very high stakes for the school. And every child in England takes these at age 16. We also want to understand a bit more about student motivations, what actually would encourage them to change their behavior. So what we're trying to do is we're going to try two different incentive structures and see if either of these can shift effort. So the thing is, the one crucial difference between what we're doing and what previous studies have done is we're not paying for grades. We are not incentivizing output. We're not saying, okay, if you get an A star, we're going to give you some money or something. We are incentivizing input. We're incentivizing effort. And I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of slides' time. So we're trying financial treatment. We give you cash. And we're trying an event, a special event, a trip treatment. If you hit your thresholds, then you get to go on a special trip with your friends from school. So what does effort mean? So effort here means attendance at school, no unauthorized absences. It means completing your work while you're actually sat in the class with the teacher, completing that work on time and to the appropriate standard, completing your homework, and also behaving well in class, actually conducting yourself well and not causing a riot. I think I just said all this. The project is designed to increase our understanding, to sort of further research, but also trying to think about designing a policy for raising attainment of kids in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And then finally, I'm interested in the idea of one particular non-cognitive attribute that researchers have been talking about lately, which is the idea of a particular one called conscientiousness. I guess we all probably know what conscientiousness means in some sense, but I'm interested to know how that relates to this idea of effort and trying hard at school, and whether you can actually incentivize people to do this, whether in the long run people can learn to be more conscientious. Okay, so these are the research questions that we have. Does pupil effort matter? Does it matter a lot? Can we actually shift these big, difficult achievement tests any noticeable amount? Can we intervene to alter pupil motivations? And are there important differences between pupils in how they respond to these incentives? So before I tell you the answers, you can see what the gaps are for. Before I tell you the answers, you just might think what we're going to expect. Obviously, different pupils, just as different grown-ups, like different things. Different people respond to different incentives. So we might expect there to be different effects between the two different arms. And also, of course, a lot of people out there, a lot of kids out there are very highly motivated, and they are working very hard. If you are already highly motivated and working very hard, probably chucking a little bit of money at you is not going to make a difference. So we might expect different groups, some of whom are motivated to work hard at school, are determined to get on, and some of whom are not, to have different effects. And that's exactly what we find. So for a group, which I'll tell you about in a moment, or you can read all the way to the bottom of the slide if you like, for a group that we believe are not likely to have high inherent motivation and to be working really, really hard, we do find substantial and statistically significant effect sizes on these GCSE scores, on these crucial exit exams at the end of compulsory schooling. Okay, so for some groups, and actually we'll see in a moment it's an important group, yes, we can. Can we change motivations? Well, one worked, one didn't. The financial intervention, namely rewarding people who hit their effort targets with money, that's what created these effect sizes. The motivation, which was based around collective school trips for people who hit their thresholds, really didn't have any effect on anything much at all. So what are these two groups? So the overall effect was small, positive, not trivial, but not significant. If you split people up into these two groups, one of whom we might imagine are highly motivated, determined to succeed, determined to get on, working really hard already, they do not show any effect at all for either treatment in any subject we look at, in any subgroup. So children who have, so my marker for this in the data set is, do you have English as an additional language? Is English not spoken at home? Those guys show no effect for anything ever. The other group are everybody else, people who have English as a first language, and those are the ones for whom we get the substantial effect sizes at the top. I know we're not supposed to go around chasing subgroups. I completely understand that, and I completely understand why. But it seems to me this is not a subgroup of people who are tall or people who are born on Wednesdays. This is a subgroup that's directly relevant to the question of motivation and effort. Okay, so in a little bit of time, I'll just talk very quickly through some of the details of the scheme. So as I said, we are incentivizing inputs, as you've seen defined, not outputs. Why are we doing that? We're doing that partly because of timing. So Sally and John's work with Stephen Levitt has shown that if you give rewards very, very quickly after people have done the task, then that's highly effective. And if you give them the rewards about a year later, it makes no difference at all. If we were incentivizing GCSE grades, it would be over a year before they got to see the answer. So we're incentivizing inputs. We're also incentivizing inputs because people know how to work a bit harder at what they're doing now. Not everybody necessarily. If I say, get an A star in maths, people will say, I have no idea how to get an A star in maths. You could pay me £1 million to build a car. I still couldn't build a car. Pay me 10 million, it still wouldn't work. So it's about what you know how to do, and then you can just go out and do it. Types of incentive, cash and events. The events were chosen by the pupils, obviously subject to a budget constraint. So they were meant to have some kind of ownership. We were not trying to set the events up to fail. I seriously thought it would have some impact. One of the key decisions in this field, which anyone who's working in RCTs and schools will know, is what level can you randomize, at pupil level or at school year level? I think there are good arguments either way. One of the arguments in favour of the school year level was that was what the funder wanted. I think it was actually a good choice because when we went recruiting schools and teachers care a lot about fairness and treating people the same. So I think if we'd randomised some pupils to get some money, some not, the schools may well have tried to substitute for that and they would have given something. So I think it's actually a good reason. But it had a huge effect on the power of the study. We have 10,000 pupils and we have 63 schools. So draw your own conclusions. Time unit. Okay, we wanted long-run learning. We weren't just interested in raising effort for a day or an hour or a week. We wanted people to try harder over a period of time. On the other hand, the immediacy of the rewards is very important, so we compromised on a 5-week period, and we had 4 5-week periods over the year. We did English, maths and science, partly because those are compulsory for the 15, 16-year-old kids we're talking about. Obviously, in some sense, you're worried about diversion. Okay, they're putting more effort into these, but less effort into anything else. So all you're doing is reallocating it. On the other hand, it simply wasn't feasible for us or the schools to do this sort of threshold information collection. Did the kids hit their threshold or not across all of the subjects? It was a threshold design. Did you hit your target? Did you not hit your target? Everyone knows that there are problems with that. You know, if you've already hit it, no incentive. If you've no chance of hitting it, no incentive. But it was simple. Didn't give us as much data as we would have liked, but there you go. 1-year program. Oh yeah, we used loss aversion. The idea was to try to get the kids to think of this as their money already, and that they were going to lose it. Again, previous work from Sally and John have shown that loss aversion is and many others have shown that loss aversion is very powerful. We couldn't do it in fact. We couldn't give them the money and then yank it back out of their hands. So we tried to use words. We sort of, there is a seat booked on this coach for you to go on the trip. Please don't miss out. This money is yours. Don't screw up. Don't lose the money. I'm not going to spend any time talking about this. I'm saying, why might this not work? It may not work because you don't know how to hit the target. It may not work if you don't really care about the prize at the end of it. And then the one that I've obviously sort of focused on as the key one for one group is it may not work if you actually can't work any harder. You are actually fully motivated as it is. Okay, spend a little bit of time on this. Why would you expect one to work and one not to work? Economists are always in favour of of money rather than in kind. So that's probably a factor. The pupils had to choose essentially one event, one trip. And if you're going to see Wembley Stadium, if you're going to see a boy band, half of the people you're interested in may not care about that at all.
Sorry, Thomas, we've got 1 minute left.
1 minute, okay. So I'm going to skip the rest of that. I think the point is, I'll just make one point here, which is that cash is private. Nobody knows if you hit your target, if you get cash. And so I think if you are interested in not losing face to your friends and secretly working hard, cash is much better. Okay, so overall effect, as I said, not trivial, but small, not significant. Splitting up by these two groups, we get really interesting effects. Not going to talk about that, obviously. I'm interested in the idea that you can learn conscientiousness. If we've managed to trigger people to put more effort in, and they've found out that they got a much better GCSE grade in maths than they were expecting, they've learned something. Maybe when they do their next course next year, they'll try harder again. Okay, so one of the things we're going to do, again, the locals will know when you finished your GCSEs, if you stay in school, you take more exams, and 2 years later, called A-levels. They took those A-levels a few months ago. They'll know the results. We're going to get that data and see if there's any treatment effect on the people taking A-levels. All sort of, there's a million ideas you can think of. So there we go.
Thanks very much, Simon. We've got time just for one question. There's quite a few hands going up because it's a very interesting topic. Sorry, that gentleman there. Chris, you want to bring it down here? It's the first hand up. It's the fairest system we're going to use.
Hi, Harry Fletchwood from Teach First. From what we know about offering extrinsic motivation, when it's taken away, effort then reduces. So it's great to hear that you've tracked it through to A-level, which is half of what I was going to ask. But did you consider at any stage anything that would tap into or increase intrinsic motivations, which we know have more lasting and more powerful effects?
Well, I think if it's intrinsic, then it's hard to actually shift that. I think that's the point. We obviously worried quite a lot about harming intrinsic or inherent motivation, and the EF, as funders of this, also worried a lot about that. We had a number of conversations. Review of evidence in this field, i.e. of pupil motivations, suggests that there actually isn't any evidence that that happens. There's a lot of people who have looked at this, they followed people up after their intervention, and it really doesn't show up in any way. So I think, we are going to look at the A-level scores. We haven't done that yet. I could see three possible outcomes. One is that nothing happens at all. It was just it just happened when it happened. And one of them is that things are worse. There's a negative outcome, as you say. Once we've kind of got people used to the idea that we pay them for doing this, they're not going to do it if they're not going to pay it. But I can also see that there might be a positive long-term effect, which is where I finished up. If you've been in a place where you've never had any evidence that actually trying hard makes any difference, so you don't try hard, then you're in an equilibrium and you just stay like that forever. If something smashes that equilibrium and suddenly you decide to work hard just for the money, and then you find you've done a lot better, maybe you'll learn something and you'll carry on. So I could see that it could be a positive or negative or a zero effect, and watch this space.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. So Todd has flown over, arrived yesterday. He's Associate Professor at Harvard Kennedy School. Also, again, full disclosure, I've been working with him quite closely for the last couple of years, so no difficult questions, please. Okay, so Todd, you have 10 minutes starting now.
Thank you. So that was interesting, Simon. So incentives work for students who we think have some slack and don't use boy band tickets to motivate ever. Okay, so I need to write that down. No, okay, so my name's Todd Rogers. I used to be a pollster, and I realized there was a science of behavior change that wasn't being used in politics, and so I went and got my PhD at Harvard in this interdisciplinary program in psychology, economics, and at the business school. Basically the science of behavior change. And then after finishing, went down to DC and started Washington, DC, in America, and started a research institute called the Analyst Institute, where we translated behavioral science insights into political strategy using large-scale field experiments. And so over the course of maybe the 4 years that I ran it, from the end of 2007, beginning of 2008 to 2011, we probably ran 400 or so of these large-scale field experiments where we piggybacked off of expenditures that the Democratic Party or the labor unions or environmental groups or pro-choice groups or same-sex marriage groups, the whole liberal left, they're already spending money, and we would just insert ourselves to do low-cost randomized experiments. Like you're doing Get Out the Vote, and you're sending 1 million mailers to people. We randomize the message using specific sort of insights from behavioral science. And whether people vote in the US is public, and so it was costless and comprehensive, and we were able to estimate and replicate election over election what best practices work. And now in politics, for Get Out the Vote, for example, they're sort of almost universally used because they're costless to incorporate, and it's a competitive market. I then decided I didn't want to do politics anymore, and instead I wanted to make the world better. And so I shifted to education, not a competitive market. And so originally thought I would treat students like voters. How do we get students to show up at school, behave in class, study outside of class? Very similar to the stuff that Simon was talking about that he and Sally and others have been doing. And there's very promising work there. But then I read a paper that completely shifted my perspective about 4 years ago, and a very simple experiment, a low-performing high school where there's a learning management software where teachers put homework performance into a database. And then they randomly assign parents into two groups, treatment and control. And the treatment group for 6 months got texted without asking for it, actionable information about missing assignments. Your kid didn't turn in their math assignment on Tuesday, please get him or her to do it. Your kid didn't turn in their English assignment on Friday, please get him or her to do it. On average, about 2 assignments a week for 6 months. And the treatment group performed it was a small experiment, so I don't take the effect size that seriously, but the direction is totally right. They increased standardized test scores by 1/4 of a standard deviation, increased GPA, comparably crazy amount. But the coolest part is they then survey the treatment group and control group parents and say, relative to the information you've been getting, treatment group control, would you like more, the same, or less? Right? The treatment group's been getting a ton. The control group gets what they always get, which is nothing. And the treatment group wanted still more, the control group didn't change. Right? Which is to say that it's not that the treatment was satisfying a pre-existing demand for information, it was creating demand. Parents don't know what they don't know. When you empower them with actionable information, they act on it, they improve student achievement, they want more of it. So I completely shifted everything we do over the last 4 years to how do we mobilize and empower families and friends to support student achievement outside of school. And sort of in the context of what you were talking about, I'm trying to develop low-cost, scalable interventions, and not any one of these interventions is going to fix any problem. These are all going to be small, insanely cost-effective, easy-to-implement interventions that will be parts of a larger program that are complements to this bigger program. So there are 3 basic... So I'm just going to have pictures. Under normal... Then I would say, I thought I would focus on these guys, the little people, and now I focus on the big people. There are 3 buckets of work that we do. The first is trying to connect families to what's going on in the classroom. Just like that experiment I described, how we push out missing assignments. With Raj, funded by EEF, we've been doing a 1.5 year long project doing exactly this, trying to push out actionable information to parents through text. And there's something important to say, like there's nothing magical about text messages. When it's a specific, discrete action, it makes a ton of sense to push it out in a way that they can immediately get it. But if it's like a vague message, a text that just goes into the sort of ether somewhere. So if it's a discrete, concrete thing. So one thing that Raj and I and Simon and is funded by EEF have done, when we text, we call it pre-informing. We text parents 5 days before a major test, and we tell them, your kid has a major test in 5 days, please get him or her to study. And then we remind them later, right? Completely straightforward, but parents basically never hear about tests until after the fact, and it's always, it's too late, but your kid is failing. So what we found is that just alerting parents increased performance on the test by 0.1 standard deviations. And the effects are twice as big for the bottom performers as they are for the top performers. Kids, parents, teachers, so kids don't like it, but they like it more than they thought they would. Parents, 80% of parents want us to continue, and the teachers like it. And this is sort of one bucket, which is just pushing out actionable information to parents. How do we connect families to what's going on in the classroom? The second bucket is how do we connect more people who care about the student with the student's education? So the best example is stuff we're doing in higher ed, where when a student enrolls, so I'm enrolling, say, in an online 4-credit college. I enroll and I am asked to name a friend or family member with whom I communicate regularly. So I talk to Raj let's pretend we talk all the time. We talk frequently enough, but I name Raj as my friend. We're going to pretend I name Raj as my friend. So each week, Raj gets a message saying, one, Todd has asked you to support him through his college education. 2, this week, Todd learned about Oedipus. Ask him why Oedipus poked his own eyes out. And then the next week, it's like Todd has a midterm. When you talk to him, ask him what his study plan is. And the next week, Todd's making re-enrollment plans for next semester. Ask him what classes he's going to take. The idea is how do we turn existing social systems into social support, right? Because like, especially in college, students have, the vast majority of students are non-residential and not even full-time. And so they have jobs, family, friends that are all taxes and basically structurally cut out of their educations, who'd be more than happy to be turned on if we can invite and empower them. So the first is how do we connect families with what's going on in the classroom, and the second is how do we connect more people who care about the student to the student's education. And so we're doing versions of this with younger kids too, where we ask guardians to name other adults who care about their kid, a coach, a mentor, a grandparent, and then we do the same thing, treat them as guardians, push report cards out to them, give them actionable information. But it does 2 things. I do want to underscore, it does 2 things. It invites them. It actively invites them. They're not in this sort of liminal place of somewhere between being invested in the kid's education and caring about them and just being structurally cut out. We actively invite them, and then we also give them actionable information. The second is, the third bucket is how do we correct miscalibrated beliefs? And this feels a lot more like psychology, which is a lot of parents hold beliefs that are just not accurate. Not all of them matter. Right? So not all false beliefs are causally consequential, and not all of them are actually changeable. But there are some that we are starting to find are really causally consequential and changeable. Inspired by O-Power, which I assume folks here have seen before, but basically O-Power sends you a message saying you use more energy than your neighbors. These are your neighbors, this is you. Turns out it's really effective. I and others have studied it over the last 6 or 7 years. The effect grows over time. They send these things every month or every quarter. It reduces energy use, the equivalent of increasing the price of energy by 1/3. And they send it by mail, right? And what you hear reports of is that these things become social objects in the home, right? Because we don't know, we're trying to get you to change energy use the whole time. People put it up on their fridge, and then they talk about it. They show it to the other people in their household. So this is not a ideal text kind of message. So I've done surveys in a bunch of the largest urban districts in the US, and I guess if I could go dark, I would here. But the majority of low attending students' parents, so think of like a 10-year-old, their classmates miss 5 days a year, they miss 30 days. The majority of those parents think that their kid's attendance is average or better compared to their classmates. Right? They know that they're supposed to get their kid to school, they just don't know what everyone else is doing. And it's not their fault. Like, we never convey that information to parents. We say, get your kid to school, your kid missed school, but we don't say what the norm is. So that naturally, I mean, it doesn't take much inspiration to go from that insight and this to, so we've been running experiments where we do O-Power for attendance, where we, in as simple language as possible, and in native language, so we translate it, and we also pilot it so that the language is clear to people with low literacy. And then we use, and then we send them this graph saying, Todd has missed this many days, his classmates have missed this many. Please, if we can be of help, please help get Todd to school. And what we found is that this can increase attendance at a cost of about $2 per incremental day of increased attendance, whereas the next best interventions we know from randomized experiments, which is mentors and truancy officers and social workers, cost about $100 per incremental day. I guess that's some number of pounds.
Todd, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. So that, and it doesn't fix the problem, right? Like, undoubtedly, a more intensive treatment is going to shave off more days, just nowhere near as cheaply and nowhere near as easy to implement at the administrative level. So the big takeaway, there are three ways that we're trying to mobilize and empower social systems to support students. The first is connect families with what's going on in the classroom. The second is connect more people who care about the student with the student's education. And the third is identify and correct miscalibrated beliefs. And the overarching philosophy of this work is, instead of viewing families as deficits, which is a common view, which is that a big part of the problem with kids is that their families are the problem, we try and take an asset-based view, which is wherever families are, how do we make them more effective? How do we invest in empowering them? They may not be spending a ton of time. How do we make the time they spend more effective? They may not have the highest degree of education, but how do we make their time more effective? And so sort of thinking of them as assets that we can empower more effectively. That's a sort of overarching view, and that's it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Todd. It's a lot of work in an incredibly fast time. Thanks. Questions, please. Yes, Stefan? Yeah, again, if you just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from University of Chicago. I was wondering if you have any research about like the optimal frequency of like the SMS text messages, right? Like, I can see if I get a message every day, I'll start ignoring it.
So the question is about optimal frequency of text messages. That's an engineering problem. I don't have a very good answer for that. We're working, I mean, like, so we're doing some of these things. Most of it we try to replicate several times before we publish it. The one thing I can say is that in politics, in 2006, texting someone before an election increased turnout by about 4 percentage points. Made it one of the most effective ways to increase turnout. Then in 2008, Barack Obama announces his vice presidential nominee through text. And he says, you have to give me your text number before I will tell you this. And so the entire thing was inspired by this research in 2006. And so then in 2008, we found about a 2 percentage point effect for text messages. 2010, 1%, and we have not been able to find effects since, because everyone uses it now. And so there's nothing magic about the modality. It's just, it's how do we capture and maintain attention, and then conditional on that, how do we deliver a message that we care about? Right now, we're getting through to parents in this way, but undoubtedly that'll stop, and it'll be like Pinterest or something. I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, lady at the back. Yeah, Chris.
I just have a question, really. You were talking about the kind of impact and increasing performance for tests and that sort of thing. Have you looked at the impact of the pressure that you're putting on children and the damage that you might do with that pressure by having lots of other people then pressurizing them about school?
Yeah, so this is a question about over-parenting or helicopter parents. And that is at the complete other end of the spectrum that we're concerned about. There ends up being in the US, there's a big national discussion about this over-parenting and helicopter parents. It turns out it's a tiny fraction of all parents. And it's not the parents that I'm most concerned about. But that said, as we start doing this, I tend not to even work in districts where that's like the biggest problem, or even one of the 50 biggest problems. But eventually we will start to figure that out. And I mean, I think it would be, I'd like to see that there's no effect in these sort of districts where we have this over-parenting problem. But I suspect that what the over-parenting is more parental motivation, and that they still don't have much actionable information to be able to help. They just put a lot of pressure on their kids. So.
Any more? Yeah, just down the front here. Sorry, Chris, giving you the runaround. Thank you. If you could just introduce yourself at the start of the question as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Lynn. I've come from a company called Holland. I had a question about the content of the text messages that you sent. Would you send, say for example, at the end of the week, would you send a text message saying, little Johnny has missed 2 assignments, his math assignment and his English assignment? Or would you send a text to all of the parents saying, or to each of the parents saying, little Johnny has completed 8 out of his 10 assignments. He is still missing. So does the wording in terms of basically positive reinforcement as opposed to negative reinforcement, does that make a difference?
So we've never done that, and now that we've built an infrastructure, and as we continue to build an infrastructure, we'll start doing those kinds of things. Undoubtedly, those kinds of framings will be helpful. We did an experiment in a summer school where we sent 1-sentence messages to parents of summer school. So in the US, there's a summer school of 5 weeks for low-performing kids, and we asked teachers each week to write something the kid did well and should continue doing, and something the kid did poorly and should discontinue doing. And then we randomly assigned parents we would deliver the message through text or phone or whatever their preferred modality was. Control, nothing. The positive encouragement, and then the needs to improve. And we were a little underpowered, but the needs to improve was about twice as effective as the positive encouragement at reducing dropout from the summer program. We reduced dropout by like 40% from the summer program. Basically, parents never hear anything. They just live in the dark on what's going on in school. But I think in equilibrium, as we repeatedly do stuff, it's got to be the case that we've got to sprinkle in like discrete like progress reports. But we're at this point, we don't know yet. But of course, we don't know what it is, but of course it's got to be right.
Okay, thanks, Todd. That's the last one we have time for at the moment, but I'm sure there'll be time for more questions later when everyone's up on stage. Thanks very much, Todd. Okay, and next we have Sally Sadoff from UCSD, previously from Chicago. I imagine tried to escape the cold weather. Off you go, Sally. Thank you.
Thanks. And this is actually the first time I've ever been glad to go last in a panel because basically everybody has set up everything I want to talk about, so maybe I can skip over a lot. This is joint with a lot of people. The first experiment I'm going to talk about is with Roland Fryer at Harvard and Steve Levitt and John List, who have been mentioned at Chicago. And then the second experiment is with Steve, John, and Rob Metcalf, who's now at Chicago, but originally from this side of the pond. Simon talked about students, and Todd talks. I thought Todd was going to talk about. Todd talked a little bit about parents, and Anna talked about teachers. So I'm going to kind of come back to teachers. And most of these questions were already answered for me by Anna, but why teachers? So I agree. I think teachers are key, and there's been some really important studies showing that, first of all, there's a lot of variation in teachers, and a lot of it is within a school. So I used to think, oh, there's good schools and there's bad schools. It turns out that within a school, there's good teachers and there's bad teachers, and this variation in teacher quality matters a lot. It matters not just for your test scores, but it matters for important long-term outcomes that we care about, like whether you go to college, your income, whether you have a teen pregnancy. So a whole host of outcomes we care about can be tracked back to how good of a teacher you had in, say, 5th grade. I think the other reason I liked working with teachers is that if you intervene on a single teacher and improve that teacher's quality, she has or he has an impact on 20, 30 students that year, and then 20 or 30 more students going forward. And so that intervention can have a really large impact, and it's in some ways easier to integrate into the school structure. So I think if you talk to Todd or Simon or I, you'll hear that it's hard to reach parents. I really like how Todd is doing his stuff because he's found a way to reach parents and reach people outside of school, but teachers, we know where they are, they're employees of the school, and so it becomes more natural in some ways to work with them. So why do we want to think about incentives? And Anna mentioned this a little bit, but we really don't know much about how to improve teacher quality. There's been a lot of effort around both trying to screen teachers and select the right people into the profession and also to train teachers. And we just don't have that sort of best practices yet on how to improve teacher quality, although I think there's some really interesting research on personalized coaching, which trains teachers on the job. It sort of takes the medical school model of taking teachers where they are and mentoring them and giving them very individualized, personalized feedback that I think is really promising. As Anna mentioned, there's also there's sort of mixed evidence on traditional methods of merit pay, especially in developed countries. So this is sort of where we come in and say, okay, well, is there a role for behavioral economics in designing these incentives in such a way that they might be more effective? So what did we do? We worked with primary school teachers in a low-performing U.S. school district, and we offered them incentives based on value added, so how much progress their students made relative to other students who started at the same baseline. And that's really important. Teachers really like to hear that they're being compared to other teachers who are given the same students. I think teachers often feel like they're being rewarded or punished just based on the students they happen to receive. So it's important for teachers to hear that it's based on how much they improve their students. And the reward was $4,000, which, as Todd says, is some amount of pounds, and that's equivalent to about 8% of a teacher's salary in the district. So teachers were randomly assigned to control, where they received no incentive, to the gain treatment, where they received their total reward at the end of the year, which is just how merit pay has always been done. And then our innovation was to introduce this loss treatment where we actually write teachers a check for $4,000 at the start of the year. It's a check for them. They deposit it in their bank account, but they sign a contract with us saying that if they fail to receive $4,000 through the program based on their performance, they have to return the difference between $4,000 and their final reward. Or if they overperform, if they perform above average, then we give them the difference between $4,000 and any additional amount they earned. And then a slight complication was that in order to, performance pay is really controversial in the US at least. And so we were really lucky to even have a teachers union that agreed to do this. And part of the agreement with them was that any teachers that were assigned to control in the first year had to receive incentives in the second year. So we ran a second year of the program where we re-randomized teachers, but this creates a lot of complication because teachers experience different things across the years and students were exposed to teachers who had received different incentives across the years. So what do we find? In year one, we see that both treatments have a positive impact, and the loss treatment is about twice as large as the gain impact, and that is a significantly different, that difference is significant. In the second year, we see lower effects and no difference between loss and gain. So part of this might be due to the complications of the randomization. Part of it might be that you get a one-time bump that fades. So we really want to understand how can we use incentives in such a way that we can actually sustain these performance increases. But we do think that this is a promising avenue, and we want to try to build on it to maybe possibly combine it with other interventions that might make it more effective. Okay, so where should we go next? I've been sort of, anyone who will listen the past couple of days, I've been talking about individualizing intervention. So I think that I obviously believe very strongly in RCTs, and I'm so grateful to EEF that's funded the next study I'm going to talk about in my study with Simon, bringing RCTs into schools. But I think generally the approach to RCTs so far has been, okay, offer some intervention to everybody and measure the average treatment effect. But I think we know, teachers know, parents know that you need to differentiate different interventions for different parents, different teachers, different students. So for instance, Todd's intervention on attendance, that was really focused, I'm assuming that the impacts are on those students that are missing 30 days, not on the students that are missing 2 or 3 or 4 days. So that intervention really needs to be targeted at those students that aren't attending. Or the study that Simon talked about, we see that it's going to be most effective for those students who are undermotivated. So I would really like to see the direction of interventions to go towards designing studies up front to understand how do we match people to the right interventions, with the right combination of interventions, and not have it be, as Simon said, it looking like an ex post, I cut the data in all these ways, and this is the subgroup that I found that it worked for, but actually designing programs to understand who needs what. So I think of it in terms of sort of broadly the kinds of interventions we've been thinking about is that sometimes you're trying to address sort of this information or attention gap, and I think a lot of Todd's stuff, I would say, falls into this, and that's really attractive because you can have these low-cost, low-intensity interventions that can really have a significant impact. I would say the sort of next step I think about is moving to a motivation or a cost gap. So students that are undermotivated or have high costs, for instance, of exerting effort, they might require a higher cost intervention, but it can still be fairly low intensity, so you can offer them some sort of incentive. Although I think there's some other work from people in the audience looking at things that might motivate students that don't necessarily require large incentives. So it'd be interesting.
A couple of minutes.
Okay, to hear from the audience about that. And then finally, I think the hardest thing probably to intervene on is this ability or skills gap. And that it's not maybe as sexy because it requires a higher cost, higher intensity intervention, but there are going to be those harder to reach people that are going to require that, but understanding that some parents, all they need is an actionable text message and they can then work with their student based on that. But there might be parents who, they get this text message, they have no idea what to do when they hear that their child has a test. I don't know how to help my child study. And so that's kind of where, I don't have a lot of time, but that's where this study that we ran this year comes in, where we have this parent academy where we bring parents in twice a month and focus on developing parent skills to support learning out of school. We had a control group that wasn't invited to attend, a group that was invited to attend but didn't receive an incentive for attending, and then a group that received an incentive for attendance, a 30-pound incentive for each session attended. So we're just getting the data in, so all I'm actually able to look at this point is attendance rather than program impacts. So I'll just show you quickly that. So this is the group that received no incentive, and what you see is that 17 to 20% of people attend the Parent Academy when we don't offer them the incentive. So the question here is, we're offering them this thing that we think is valuable, but it's hard to get them in. So maybe that kind of intervention needs to be combined with this motivational incentive intervention. And you see that when we offer an incentive, attendance, more than doubles to about 50%. So we're still only getting to 50% of the people, but this is a huge impact. And what we see if you look at who is attending, what we do is we move about 30% of people from attending no sessions to attending 10 or more sessions. So what we're doing is, it's not just that we're getting people to show up and then they just kind of show up for the money a couple times. We actually get people who think that they don't want this thing to show up and then really fully engage in the program. So we do think that that's promising. And then what we really want to understand moving forward is understanding which parents are going to be most responsive to the program and to incentives. Who is in that 30% of parents that doesn't come when they don't receive an incentive and then fully comes when they do? And which parents might be responsive to a lower cost intervention. So if we're thinking about the future of interventions, I think it's about testing this suite of interventions that people have been talking about and how to think about who would benefit most from what so that we can offer these in a really cost-effective way, and more generally to design studies to not only measure average treatment effects, but to better understand how to match individual pupils, parents, and teachers to the most cost-effective combination of interventions.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, we have time for a couple of questions before the others all join us back on stage for a final discussion. Jeff, yeah?
So you can tell us about the motivational interventions that don't cost a lot of money.
I was just wondering with your, where you re-randomize people in year 2?
Yeah.
So is that, so can you look at teachers who got a reward the first year, but then who didn't, and did they respond differently?
Yeah, exactly. We do have teachers moving in and out, as you say. Here we run into a power problem where we just don't have enough teachers to really look at it. But that's exactly what we would love to be able to do if someone wants to fund a scaled-up teacher incentive study. Is there anyone out there? But I think that would be really interesting to understand. Yeah.
Yep. Brothers?
See if you want to open it up.
Yeah. Anna, yeah. So one sec, we'll just wait for the mic to come down.
Thanks. I'm really interested in both the talks, actually, about which kind of parents are responding to which kind of intervention.
Yeah.
So, for example, the absence one that you talked about shouldn't work here because we have norms, they're sent to parents, they're published. You're not allowed more than X days off a year, this is well communicated, parents get letters about their child having absence, etc., etc. So were you to do an intervention, you must be coming off a different kind of margin in an environment where they don't get that kind of information. And here I was interested in more in actually the ones that don't respond without the incentive and don't respond with the incentive, and what kind of parents they are and what their pupils' achievement levels are, and whether or not we're actually pushing on a quite different margin than we might think we are.
Yeah, and it could go in either direction. So I was talking to someone at our EEF partner about this yesterday, that when we saw that only 50% of parents were attending, our first instinct was, we need to make the incentive bigger. Because we're really concerned about power, that we're just going to have trouble detecting impacts when you have such a low attendance rate. But I think EEF rightly pushed back and said, well, first of all, if you need to pay £100 to get people into this program, no school is ever going to implement this. Was not relevant from a policy perspective. But I think even more important, it might be that at £30, you're getting those families that are very sensitive to £30. So you might be that the more sort of advantaged families are not going to change their decision making about whether this is of value based on £30. But families where that £30 actually makes a difference. So we are hearing from our partners that it was a £30 voucher to a grocery store. This is really meaningful to some of the families in their community. So it might be that that having it at around £30 does potentially, we don't know yet, we have to look at the data, does potentially get in exactly the families that we really want to target. And that would be really interesting to see. But I think building on that, understanding how you design interventions and incentives in a way that you sort of get the right parents to select in, the ones you really want, you think benefit most from the program, I think that kind of goes along this theme that we've been thinking about.
Okay, thanks very much, Sally. If you want to okay, so now we have about 10 minutes just for some general questions. There's some common themes coming up. I notice about intrinsic motivation and maybe some thinking about outcomes that we often focus on attainment when maybe we think other things are important too. There's a couple of things to start off, some thought provocation. Yeah, we bring the mic down to the front to Mike. So we only have, sorry, Mike, we only have one mic. And
that's me.
We're going to have to see how we, and that's you, right? So you talk, and then we're going to have to relay it up to the stage. Let's see how this goes.
Maybe I can pass this around.
What, the lapel mic?
For us to talk.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, let's try doing that.
So my question's mostly to Simon, but hopefully others contribute too, especially Sally around individualization. And that's Sue Johnson-Wilder and Claire Lee's work about building mathematical resilience based on three elements: value, mindset, and effort. And I think the really interesting thing on a personal level, the individual student, is how do you get them to value this thing that they're learning? How do you get them to have a growth mindset, all of Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth and all of that, all of that work in that space? And then that leads to effort. And I think you can apply that to any domain. They have to maths, but I think it's applicable across lots of things. I think, did that feed into your work at all?
So Simon, this is you first.
So I think we're completely aware that people have different reasons for studying, and that there is very clearly an obvious reason to study hard. And I think that, and for a lot of people, education is inherently interesting and fulfilling and satisfying. And so absolutely not taking away from that. But the people, the schools, the neighbourhoods that we're interested in, there may be rather less of that around. And like I was sort of saying, if people can find themselves in a place where actually not bothering with schooling seems to me the optimal and rational thing to do. In a sense, we're trying to sort of shake them out of that idea and offer them an additional reason for putting in effort at school on top of the ones that they already have. And it's always the case that it's the next study that's going to be the interesting one. So when we do follow these people, which is a bit of a flaw really, you should always do the second study first somehow. We'll have a better answer to that.
I had one comment to make on it as well. So did you ever see a world where these incentives would be part of everyday school life? Or was it more an exercise in understanding to what extent students were working at their frontier and there was something additional they had to give? I mean, which of those two were in your mind when you're sort of designing work like that?
I think I'd like to say both really, because I think part of the thing was to try and understand motivations and to understand the role of effort. I mean, it's perfectly possible to imagine a world where most of your attainment is preordained before you start that year. And the difference between trying hard and not trying hard is not that large. So that's certainly a feasible outcome, and I think the earlier work and this paper shows that that's probably not where we are. So I completely agree that I think if this just became institutionalized and you kind of just at the end of the month you got a bit of money, then that it would probably fade out. So it's definitely a dynamic thing rather than, this is going to be a permanent answer to everything.
Yes, Anna? Yeah, if we could pass this down then. Thank you.
So just to add something on that, in a sense we've already had that experiment with the education maintenance allowance where students were paid to stay on at school past the age of 16, and it was conditional on attendance, but it wasn't so directly conditional on effort in a properly measured way. It did have an impact on attendance and continuation. It didn't have a fantastically large impact on achievement, and so we could probably learn from that kind of earlier study how not to scale it up at least. And I guess the key is there, how we monitor effort is going to be absolutely critical to whether or not it would actually succeed at scale.
Thanks, Anna. Todd or Sally, anything to add?
Let's go get paid.
Yeah,
Thank
so, this is obviously probably a bit of a backlash from me running incentive programs in education for 5 or 6 years, but I think people really don't like the idea of giving kids incentives. They think that kids should be intrinsically motivated, and part of that, I don't have the empirics on this, but it usually comes from an academic audience that likes school, obviously. That's why we're still in it. And I think that for a lot of students, that's just not true. I mean, it would be great if school was a place that everybody loved and was motivated by. And I think understanding why some students put in effort and others don't. I think some are doing it because they really are intrinsically motivated. Some are doing it because parents put pressure on them. I think few of them are doing it because they see the returns 20 years down the line as modeled by economists. But I think some are doing it just out of habit. That's what you do when you go to school. When I go to school, I sit there, I raise my hand. There's a lot of norms around it, and that's just how you've been sort of trained to go to school. And so sometimes the analogy I use is that parents will use incentives to potty train their children, and then they take those incentives away, and the children remain potty trained. So if we can think about if there is a way, I think the stuff that is going on around fostering intrinsic motivation and grit, there's some really interesting interventions around that. Combining that possibly with incentives and understanding how you can use it in sort of this frame of habit formation, I think is a really interesting direction to go. People are looking for.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, other questions? So this gentleman at the front in the white shirt.
Has there been any work on sort of emphasizing positive social norms in the classroom? So there's going to be some children who love learning, and to sort of have that highlight of, hey, look, a lot of people really do enjoy this. It's the norm, rather than the noisy one at the back of the class being the one that is more salient.
Todd, you're holding the mic. Do you want to?
Psychology.
Yeah, I don't know of work on that.
Well, I guess you can say the work on peer effects is starting to get at that, because even though you're not doing it as a deliberate intervention, the impact that the balance in a classroom has impacts on other people's achievement. So I think the theory is there. There's enough empirical evidence that would suggest that an intervention based on that might have some traction, I would have thought.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's
sorry,
now that I can go sort of a little bit of like a quarter standard deviation further away with each answer from the question. The most effective way to mobilize voters that's ever been uncovered by like an order of magnitude is this social accountability manipulation, where it's like, here are your 10 nearest neighbors, and here's their voting history by name, by address. We've sent them the same thing, and after the election we will tell everyone who voted and who didn't, so your neighbors can monitor you. And so it's insanely effective. It also is a tiny bit creepy. Yeah. I'm joking. So if this is going online, it's very creepy. But it's super powerful, and so there's a bunch of us who are sort of working on different designs to try and harness internal class pressure in ways that is acceptable and respects people's privacy and autonomy like that.
Can I just quickly?
Quarter is standard, so
Yeah,
you're like
exactly.
almost.
So I think the challenge I think in the classroom is there's a really interesting experimental study that came out showing that they offer students to sign up for an SAT class, and they make it either public or private. And they find that if you're sitting in an honors class and it's public, you're much more likely to sign up. And if you're in a non-honors class, you're much less likely to sign up. So it's very driven by what the existing norms are of the people around you, and shifting those might be hard. Where I think voting, everyone thinks maybe you're supposed to vote, and so people don't want to hide that they voted. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and then we'll let you talk to these guys individually. I think, was there one there that's being answered behind you then? Yeah, sorry, I saw the hand going up, the lady there with the glasses. Thanks, Chris. And then after that, we'll take the other question there from the lady in the red top.
At some stage, we were focusing on the importance of the quality of teaching, and somebody who's got nothing to do with the teaching profession, it strikes me as being one of the hardest possible jobs. And if I listen to my friends who are close to retirement, it feels like it has got harder. And I was wondering if there is any evidence on whether the variability in teaching standards has changed over time, and whether there are any sort of experiments planned to see if making teachers' life easier, and I know a lot of these experiments do make teachers' life easier, although that's not the intention of them, possibly, and what impact that has.
Thanks. If we just take that other question first, and then we'll answer them both together. Thank you.
I was just returning to the incentives idea, really, and do you think that there's kind of a group of kids where it's not acceptable in their peer groups to look like they're making an effort at school, but actually it's okay to do that for money? And, does that work particularly well with that group?
Thank you. Okay, so the first one was about, is there any work about to happen, which you guys are about to unveil dramatically now, which is going to make teachers' lives dramatically easier? Simon, did you look keen to answer that?
Can I both of those?
You can do both of them, yeah. Please do. Simultaneously.
No. So on taking the second one first, I think that's a really important point, and there's evidence, as Sally just pointed out, and other evidence in the United States suggesting that if you want to maintain face with your peers, you really don't want to appear to be working hard. So I think that might be one of the reasons why in our project the cash worked and the event didn't, because the cash you get, it's a secret envelope, and you don't need to show your friends. With the event, it's you get on the nerd bus or you don't get on the nerd bus. It's really very public. Everybody gets to see who goes on it. So I think it's very important to try and design things where you can get around that, and that the kids can make their own decision in their own way. In terms of teachers, we are halfway through another EEF-funded project looking at teacher effectiveness. It's absolutely right, and I think everybody here would agree that teachers are incredibly important and incredibly variable. And all of the research and all the calculations suggest if you can improve teacher effectiveness, that's the huge prize here in trying to raise attainment. So our project is trying to do that by using teacher peer observation. So you find a school, you randomly assign some teachers to be observers and some to be observees. So it's no evaluation. This is not about a pay rise. It's not about being fired. You just sit in on my class and you write down what you see, and I sit in somebody else's class and I write down what I see. So I don't know whether it makes their lives easier. It's meant to make their lives better. They're meant to try and get feedback from their peers. So again, we'll see how that works out.
Thanks, Simon. Todd, did you have some to add?
Okay, I'll go. Okay, I'll just add about teachers that I completely agree. I think there's so much pressure on teachers now, and I think teachers are really feeling like they're, again, being punished for the students they have. They're being held responsible completely for student achievement when, you know, they're trying to do what they can with the students they're given. I taught for a couple years, and I always say to teachers that those who can't do, teach. Those who can't teach, go to graduate school. And I think that endears me to them, hopefully. But I think that's kind of comes back to this thing I was saying about individualization. I would really like to move forward and ask teachers, what would you like? What do you think would help support you? I think, is it money? Is it coaching? Is it observations? You know, do teachers know what they would benefit from? Because I think what happens is we often think we have this policy, we put it on teachers and they say, look, I'm already overloaded. I can't take an extra half hour to go into a classroom and observe. But other teachers say, I'm feeling lost. That 15 minutes would be incredibly valuable to me. So I think if we can actually go to teachers and ask them, what would you like, and see if they actually know kind of what programs are best for them, I mean, that's where I would like to see things go.
Yeah, I say this with my wife as a teacher, is that it's really hard to change what teachers do because they're humans with limited time and tons of taxes and more demands on their time increasingly, it seems. So the way that discussions about parent engagement and parent involvement have generally gone, it's teachers and schools need to invite and involve parents more in stuff that is basically just pure tax to teachers. It may or may not improve student success, but it is just an increased demand on the teachers. And so what we have tended to focus on, and as I look, all of the stuff we're doing isn't asking teachers to do stuff differently, which is a different program of research, like the coaching, which is hopefully seen as an opportunity instead of a burden. It's all, how do we develop interventions that, if in my space, it's how do we do them that they're scalable so that they can be done without being a tax on teachers, which is leveraging administrative data and communication systems that don't require teachers to do stuff. In addition to being easier to teachers, what we have seen is we now have hundreds of thousands of students receiving our interventions, is that it's actually way easier to actually bring them to scale because you don't need to change what anyone other than the person in charge of the administrative process thinks should be done, because you don't need to involve everyone. And again, these are like small marginal improvements that are extremely cost effective, but they're not systemic change, and they're different tracks and complementary. But basically, to bring things to scale, it appears to be way easier to do when you design interventions that are easy to scale. That is like noise is silent, like Danny Kahneman said yesterday. Or was it noise? Noise is silent.
Noise is surprisingly silent. Yeah. You said it better than that. Yeah.
Just like to add one point on that one. I mean, some of the debates that we've been having in discussions with people who are doing EEF projects is the extent to which you're really costing teacher time. So I'm sure your interventions are very light for the teacher. Simon's is not, even though it might look like it, because if you're monitoring effort and you're doing anything additional in the classroom, there's a time involved in it. And I think one of the problems we have is when we put it, whether we're testing an intervention or worse, developing a national policy, we add it, we never take away anything, and we don't cost teacher time. You know, if I could change one thing, it would be that you cannot get any teacher to do anything without taking something away, or at least acknowledging that something will be dropped and trying to have a discussion about what that might be. Because at the moment, even a light intervention involving you to sign a planner of 33 kids in a classroom to show that they all turned up on that day is not a cost-free exercise. And we ignore that at our peril, I think.
Thanks very much, Hannah. So I promised you all 20 minutes to talk to the guys individually. That time has unsurprisingly shrunk to about 3 minutes. So we're going to have to wrap things up here.